Good afternoon. Today's presentation is going to be about what people call the Low Countries or the Benelux countries. That is Belgium, Netherlands, or Luxembourg. They got their name in 1948 when they joined together in an economic consortium, much like the EU today, and they had free trade between all of the three participants. The Low Countries, or the Benelux countries, are very important historically to the United States. Americans fought there in both World War I and World War II. And I've got to say, even till today, the people of these three countries are very thankful for the sacrifices that Americans made on their behalf. From 1991 through the summer of 1994, Carol and I lived and worked just outside of Brussels, Belgium. And after that period, after 1994, I traveled to the Low Countries numerous times each year until I retired. Each of the Benelux countries are relatively small, and from where we lived in Brussels, we could get to the Netherlands just as easy as we here at Carroll Lutheran can get to Pennsylvania. Or correspondingly, we could get to Luxembourg just as easy as we could get to drive from here to Virginia. There are over 800 working windmills and millions of tulips in the Netherlands. These two windmills are probably the most photographed windmills in the country. They are just south of Rotterdam, and actually there are 8 of them along this stream that pump water into the tulip fields. You might notice that the windmills are not turning. And that's because if you look at the slats on the windmill, canvas is extended out onto them much like a sail on a sailboat. And then when the wind blows, they turn. You'll also notice that the roof on top, that funny looking roof, it rotates around 360 degrees so that you can catch the most desirable wind. Pictures of the old windmills that still exist today, and you can see the canvas that is unfurled out onto the slats. But more importantly, around the country today, you have the new windmills, either those that are offshore or dotted throughout the country. And that is because the Netherlands sees the threat of global warming and is pushing to remove itself or take itself off of fossil fuels as the means of generating electricity. Their goal is to be fossil fuel free by 2025. And the way they're putting these new windmills up, they're going to make it. My father fought in both Belgium and the Netherlands, and as a child brought me back a pair of wooden shoes. Wooden shoes were used in the fields because where the tulips grow, the ground is very soggy and wet, and leather shoes would disintegrate. Today, they still make over 700,000 wooden shoes a year, but they're mostly for tourists. We begin our tour of the Netherlands by looking at this map. I've outlined 2 cities, Amsterdam and The Hague. In Dutch it's called, and you're going to hear me call it, Den Haag. They are both the capitals of the Netherlands, but most of the government is in Den Haag, where the parliament is, where the king, they have a constitutional monarchy, just like England is located. Amsterdam is more of a ceremonial capital. You might note that I am calling the country the Netherlands and not Holland. And that is because Holland, which a lot of Americans, and even in their marketing, they call it Holland. Holland only refers to two counties that are around Amsterdam. The official name of the country is the Netherlands. As we visit each of the three countries today, I'm going to introduce you to the people who live there. This is a group. Actually, it's in Rotterdam, but that doesn't matter. But you'll note that not all of them are white Caucasians. And that is because 20% of the nation today are folks that came from Indonesia. Why Indonesia? Because Indonesia used to be a colony of the Netherlands. The folks in the Netherlands are the fourth richest per capita nation in Europe. They're very industrious and they absolutely love Americans. 44% of the country has at least a bachelor's degree. Welcome to Amsterdam. It's located at the bottom of the Zuider Sea. It's a beautiful town with lots of canals and typical Dutch architecture. If you think some of those cars are close to the canals, you're right. They do have a problem when somebody gets a little bit too much to drink. Sometimes those cars fall in the canal, and every year there's at least 5 or 6 that have to be lifted out of the canals. Forgetting the risk of your car going into the canal, think how convenient it is if you can park your car and your boat right by your front door. Like most Europeans, the folks in the Netherlands love their flowers, as you're going to see in the next few minutes. They can grow flowers because the temperatures do not get as hot in the summer as they do here. And so you'll see flowers in window boxes and throughout the country. The region that I have circled on this map is where you would find most of the tulip growing occurring. The colored squares and rectangles are the fields blooming bulb flowers. At this time of year, you will see that they cut the flowers off and they make leis that they put on the front of their cars. Please note the windmill again. Also note the canals with the boats going up and down, the main transportation in the area. Thought you might like to see the rows of tulips growing up close and personal. This is the world famous Keukenhof Park. Each year, bulb growers plant approximately 3 million tulips bulbs in a 200-acre park. The park serves two purposes. It is a showcase for the growers, but it also allows hundreds of thousands of people to see the flowers in very beautiful settings. The park is only open 2 months in the year, in the spring. Unfortunately, this year people will not see the beauty because the park is closed due to the virus. I hope you'll enjoy the next couple of slides showing you some of the settings of the tulips and other flowers in Keukenhof. We now journey to the north of the Netherlands in an area called the Zuider Zee. You remember the Zuider Zee from the little boy, the story about the little boy who stuck his finger in the dike to protect his village. The area in light blue that you will see up there called the Walden Sea, that is Dutch for the North Sea. They don't call it the Zuider Zee, they call them these other Dutch names, but that's the English name that we've given to the area. The area between the dark blue and the light blue is a very long dike, which I will show you in a few minutes, which has enabled the Dutch to lower the level of the Zuider Zee. In so doing, they've been able to reclaim land, and that land is all new land in green color. Large islands, which they eventually built cities and villages on. But it took them 10 years because it takes 10 years to get the salt out of the earth. When eventually they are able to build, they build beautiful small little villages. This is typical of the housing that's being built on those islands, canals right behind everybody's house, and those canals connect out into the Zuider Zee. So once again, you can have your car and your boat right at your house. This is the long 26-mile dike that separates the North Sea, which is on the left. If you can notice, it's hard with the picture. The part of the dike on the left side is higher than the right side where the highways are. This is not only an important dike in terms of allowing them to reclaim land within the Zuider Zee, but it connects the southern part of the Netherlands with the northern part. We now move down to the other capital, as we say The Hague, I call it Den Haag, but also Delft and the Rotterdam area. This is the train station at Den Haag. I put it in to warn you, if you go to the Netherlands, be very careful about walking in front of a railroad station. Because whether it's rush hour or whenever a train comes in, people rush off the trains and they run to their bicycles. How they find their bicycles in a pile such as this, I'll never know. But they do. They quickly get onto the bikes, and then they drive their bikes straight out of doors that are on either side of the entrance to the railroad station. Believe me, I've almost gotten run over once or twice. The Netherlands has an extensive transportation system, whether it be canals, whether it be trains, high-speed trains, local trains, trams, but people still ride bikes. And along major roadways, there are bike trails with traffic lights just for the bicyclists. This is the home of the Parliament of the Netherlands. Very beautiful building that is set on a lake. What you can't see is to the left of this building is the Palace of the King. Again, it's a constitutional monarchy. The king does live in the palace, but unlike in England, where they only come out, the king or queen only come out for ceremonial occasions, you can find the king and queen walking around Den Haag. In addition to typical Dutch architecture, they have some modern architecture. Some Dutch would argue, why are we doing this? But again, it is a major city, major commerce, major government. The building behind the statue is government offices, and I've had the pleasure of having a number of bilateral and multilateral meetings in that building. A short distance away, a tram ride, or you can even walk it from the center of Den Haag, is a beach town called Scheveningen. Beautiful white sandy beaches. But I would warn you, and you can't see this, thank heaven, but in the lower left, this is the beach during the summer, and it's about an 8-mile stretch where almost everybody is totally nude. Trust me, it's not a very pretty picture. About 4 miles to the south of Den Haag is Delft. Some of you may have pottery from Delft. It's a traditional blue pottery. If you came to our house, you would see several pieces. It is still made there by hand today. We now move a little further south, about 20 miles from Den Haag, to Rotterdam. Rotterdam is a large industrial town, high-tech town, but it is also a major seaport. It's where the Rhine River, which starts in Switzerland, meanders through Germany, and then meanders through the Netherlands, empties out into the North Sea. It is the major port for the entire of Europe. Large ships, as you can see here at the docks, come in, their containers are lifted off, they're stored, and then eventually put on a small ship, as you can see there in the canal, that goes up through various canals within Belgium or Netherlands, or goes up the Rhine into Germany and as far as Switzerland. The North Sea can get very vicious and have large storms, particularly in the winter. And those storms can push seawater up the delta of the Rhine as it enters into the North Sea. To prevent flooding, the Dutch have been doing this for years, because most of the countries below sea level have invented and implemented means to stop that water coming into Rotterdam. This is a picture of one such dam. There's a big plate. There are radar. And if there is significant water coming up, sirens go off, and all of a sudden that plate will drop down into the water and prevent the water from going into the city. This is another of those automatic dams, controlled by radar. Sirens go off and you better get out of the way, because almost like scissors, they are going to close and prevent that water from coming upriver. These are very large structures. Each one of them is as high as the Eiffel Tower. If you've been to the Netherlands, you've seen the canals. They are everywhere, including going over roadways. Transportation by barges is key to the economics of the region. We now move out onto the coast just south of Rotterdam, and there are large parts of the area that they allow North Sea to come in and on a tidal basis. But again, if there is a problem with a storm pushing lots of water, they do not want flooding. And so these are gates that again are controlled by radar. And if the water gets too high, like slices, they go down and stop that flooding. A little bit further south is a quaint little village where lots of people that sail on the North Sea will stop. We used to go there on Sundays. It was a delightful little town to walk around. Much to the architecture is from back in the 15th century. It was a great place to sit out there and just sit in the sun and relax. While we think about the Netherlands from tulips and canals and so on, the Netherlands is a very high-tech country. Lots of companies in biotech, chemistry, satellite development, so on and so forth. I had the privilege on a number of occasions of attending meetings at Philips, which is one of the largest electronics manufacturers in the world. They are very, very high-tech. Having worked in Silicon Valley out on the West Coast, they are just as capable as we are. They also provide lunch to all of their employees, and they were fantastic lunches. Some of you might be surprised that a lot of the supermarkets that you may go and purchase various food items are not owned by a company here in the United States. They are owned by a Dutch company, Ahold. Locally, Food Lion. If you look at the picture up on the left, it's actually called Delhaize in Europe, but Delhaize means Food Lion. Giant, Martin's, you go up in New England, Stop and Shop, and Hannaford are all owned by Ahold. We now move to the Duchy of Luxembourg, a very small country, I should say. You can go from one side of it to the other in less than 45 minutes. But it is a very important country in the world's economy. These are a bunch of Luxembourgese. There's only about 500,000 in the country. There is 100% literary. Almost 80% of the country has a bachelor's degree. They are the highest paid per capita of any country in Europe. And you're going to see why in a few minutes. So important to note that the language of Luxembourg is German or Deutsch. But business is conducted in French. And almost every one of them speaks English. So they speak 3 languages. This is a picture on the top right of downtown Luxembourg, city of Luxembourg. It's where most individuals live in the country. But it is surrounded, and so is the lower left picture, but is surrounded by beautiful countryside and some very beautiful castles. On the southern part, or actually the southeastern part of the country, there are lots of wine, there's a lot of wine growing, or grapes for wine. Moselle River. You think about the Moselle River in Germany, but the Moselle River comes up and into Luxembourg and actually goes over into France. The folks in Luxembourg think that their Moselle wines are superior to any other country. Offshore banking. When people think about offshore banking, they think about Switzerland or the Cayman Islands or some other place, not Luxembourg. Luxembourg is the center in the world of offshore banking. Almost all currency, particularly when you're looking at exchange rates, is set by the banking industry in Luxembourg. This is RTL. Never heard of RTL, I'm sure. But it's the world's largest media company. It produces programs on TV for 66 nations around the world and radio content in 23 other nations. We now move from Luxembourg to where Carol and I lived, in Belgium. We lived outside what's called the Ring Road here in the United States, or locally we would call it the Beltway. I was a member of the U.S. military delegation to NATO, and Carol worked as a teacher at the Brussels American School. Here are a few of the folks from Belgium. Among the residents of Belgium, 99%, they have a 99% literacy rate. But that is changing because if you've watched the news over the last couple of years, a number of immigrants have moved into Belgium from the Middle East. Belgium really has 2 different populations. Prior to the Napoleonic Wars, Belgium did not exist. After the defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo, the English, as they want to do when they win a war, they carved out a buffer state. They took land from the Netherlands and they took land from France, and they created Belgium in 1830. Those in the south were called Walloons. They were French speaking, and those in the north were called Flemish because they spoke Dutch. Today, they speak Dutch and English. The folks in the south, in the Walloon region, continue to speak only French. Probably because of the difference in languages and differences in cultures. They're a country in a state of tension at all times. They do not like each other. If you are traveling around Belgium, it's required that signs be in both Flemish or Dutch and in French. Unfortunately, if you're in the Walloon area, they'll spray paint out the Dutch word. Conversely, if you're in the Flemish area, they'll spray paint out the French word. So if you're traveling around, such example, you're going to Liège, you need to know that it's Liège or it's Luc, because either one could appear on the map. This, outside the major cities within Belgium, this is what the countryside looks like, and it looks like similar to the countryside where we lived outside of Brussels. Very nice farming area, little dots of villages all around. However, if you're driving in Belgium, I have a warning for you. On the left, those are sugar beets. This is a truck that's piling up. If you see one of these trucks driving down the road, stay far away from them, because those things are like bowling balls and they'll destroy your windshield. Why do they grow sugar beets? Sugar beets are the main source of sugar in Europe. We use cane sugar, and they use sugar beets. Personally, I think if you take a pastry that is made in Europe versus a pastry made in the United States, there is a difference in taste because of the cane sugar versus the sugar beet. At this time of year, the forests, and there are a number of them around Brussels and in the southern part of Belgium, are alive. The floor of the forests are alive with flowers. This is one that's about a 5-minute walk from the house where we lived. I mentioned Waterloo earlier. It's where the famous battle with Napoleon occurred and where he was defeated. Today, it's still memorialized. There's a big hill there and there's a museum, but most of the land on which the battle occurred is farmland. It's an area that Carol and I would pass on Sunday when we were going to church. This is a photograph from a satellite above Brussels. In Belgium, you almost do not need to have your headlights on major roads. That is because there is intense yellow lighting. So intense that when the astronauts went to the moon, they said they could see Belgium, the roads in Belgium, lit up. This is downtown Brussels, and that is a park that I've walked more than times that I want to even think about. The buildings at the end of the park are the government offices of Belgium. The reason that I was going through the park, I was always trying to find a parking place because the building all the way over on the right was the U.S. Embassy to Belgium. Belgium is unique in that it has 3 ambassadors. There's the ambassador to Belgium. A little bit further up and around the road, near that first skyscraper, is the office of the ambassador to the European Union. And if you go out of town, about 8 miles from the center of town, you come to NATO headquarters, and that is the ambassador to NATO, the U.S. ambassador to NATO. The U.S. ambassador to NATO is the senior ambassador in Belgium. This is a picture of the Grand Place. Some say it's like Times Square lit up, but it's not the gaudy Times Square. It's beautiful. It's architecture dating back to the 14th century. The building on the left is the local city hall. There are lots of events that occur in the Grand Place. It's also a place, as you'll see later at the lower part, way down on the right, is where I used to buy my chocolate to bring back to the United States. But as I say, there are a number of events that occur. But first I need to tell you a little story. It's hard to see, but there are a number of statues all the way around the Grand Place. And in many cases, there are statues of males that are pointing out. Well, there's a little story because there's one statue that is of a woman, and she is very obviously pregnant. And the story going that the one gentleman is pointing over at another gentleman, saying it's him that got her pregnant, and he's pointing to another one, and another one, and another one, and another one. It's a good story. This is one of the celebrations that will be occurring in the next couple of weeks. Every year, they decorate the Grand Place with flowers. Yes, that is not a carpet. Those are individual flower heads to make up various designs. They are placed there by hand. Brussels is a French-speaking city with Dutch architecture. There's one thing about Belgium, it is not an easy place to drive. They have a rule that anybody on the right has a right of way. Well, what's wrong with that? Well, the problem is you could be doing 60 miles an hour, not on this street, but you could be doing 60 miles an hour going along a major road, and somebody is coming out of their driveway. They have the right of way, and you have to stop for them. There were 14 of us in the U.S. military delegation at NATO. Not one of us did not have no one in that group had an accident. I grew up in New York, so driving in Brussels was very easy because, as I've mentioned before, if you can get your headlights through, you have it made. Brussels is essentially the home of the European Union, and this is the European Union Parliament. Members of all the member nations have members of Parliament just like they do in their home parliaments. They come to Brussels to meet and pass various legislation. But there's a slight problem. There are problems within the EU, there's problems with any government structure. But this parliament only meets in Brussels for a month. And then it moves to the building on the right, which is in Strasbourg, Germany. Strasbourg is located on the French-German border. They hold their meeting down there for a month, and then they move back to Brussels. A very, very cumbersome, but it's a political system that needs to be changed. There are hundreds of restaurants in the Brussels area. Belgians tend to be a little bit reserved. They don't invite people into their houses. If they're going to have celebrations, it is done at a restaurant. That includes family celebrations, birthdays, weddings, whatever. And it also includes any other social event. And as you can see, the restaurants all brew their own beer. If you look through that arch in the back, and you'll see the beer being brewed. Speaking of beer, while not in quantity, in terms of number of gallons, but in different types, in Belgium, more different types of beer are brewed than any other country in the world. Belgian waffle. Well, we all know Belgian waffles. No, you don't. You get this thing here in the United States, even at CLV, and it's something that looks like any other waffle that you pour maple syrup on. That is not a Belgian waffle. A Belgian waffle is something that you pick up at a bakery or even on stands along the road. As you can see in this picture, you hold it in your hand and you eat it. It is something with baked on, very sugary base that's baked onto the waffle. It tastes absolutely delicious. But the Belgians go one step further with their waffles, and they coat them with all sorts of things that make them even sweeter. Food. On the lower left, you say, well, those are French fries. Well, in Belgium, they're called pommes frites. Pommes frites have a unique taste. I cannot convey to you, you'd have to eat one. They taste totally different than what we call a French fry. They are absolutely delicious. Above that are what are mussels. We call mussels, they call mules. That is the national dish of Belgium. Various sauces that they're baked in and served. So you go into a restaurant and you'll order a pot of mules. On the lower right is chocolate. There are stores throughout the nation and little shops that make all sorts of chocolate. You think about Belgium, you even see in COV, Belgian chocolate. Trust me, the stuff sold here in the United States purporting to be Belgian chocolate has no compared to the stuff sold there. I'm even talking about Godiva. Godiva is considered to be like Hershey chocolate in Belgium. As I mentioned, after we left, I would go to the Netherlands and the Belgium frequently every year, and it got to be that I was carrying up to 10 kilos of chocolate back for friends. Finally, up in the top right corner, the baked goods in the bakeries are just wonderful. Again, I think it's because the sugar is from sugar beets. A little town called Bruges, which we'll visit in a few minutes, is famous for its hand embroidery of lace. Let me tell you, if you go to Belgium today, do not buy lace. Most of it is imported and machine made in China. The Belgians love bicycle races. On any weekend, you will see these 100-long groups of bicyclists racing around the countryside. We now move to Bruges. It's in the Flemish part of Belgium. You can see that by the architecture. Bruges is the Venice of the north. Canals much like Venice, around all the houses. That is the building in the center. Steeple is a very famous cathedral that dates back to the 13th century. Very, very scenic, lots of tourists, particularly in the summer. I did have a gentleman visit me in January, and it was very cold that year, but he said, I want to see Bruges. So I said, okay, we'll drive out to Bruges. Got out there, and the canals were all frozen. and people were skating on them. Like in Venice, you can take little boat tours around and get all of the history about the architecture and who lived in the various houses. We now move up to Antwerp. Antwerp is another major seaport for Europe, but it is also an important economic area. It's the diamond center of the world. 90% of diamonds cut in the world are cut in Antwerp. And they are cut by a very, very select group. And that group is made up of Hasidic Jews. One of the strange stories, I don't know how it came to be, but when I arrived at NATO, I was told that my office several times a year would become the local diamond center. A gentleman would come down with several $1 million worth of diamonds, loose diamonds, lay them out on my desk, and everybody and his brother would come along, and there was large sales of diamonds in my office. I never got a cut of the profits. It used to bother me. We move out to the eastern part of Belgium, out as we get into the mountainous area called the Ardennes. It's where the Belgian National Grand Prix is held each August. Unfortunately, where the red vehicle is, there was a major accident last year that shut down the Grand Prix for a day. 3 people were killed. But why I put this in is it's only the Grand Prix for 1 week of the year. During the rest of the year, it's a major highway going south. And I cannot tell you the number of times that Carol and I have driven down that road and waved like we were in part of the race. I mentioned the Ardennes. The Ardennes are beautiful and yet tragic. The Ardennes is where the Battle of the Bulge occurred. The Battle of the Bulge occurred in the dead of winter. And that area gets a lot of snow and is very, very cold. It was tough on the forces that were trying to defend the U.S. forces or the Allied forces, primarily Patton and his troops. It is a place today that is both beautiful, and I can't even describe it, because it is a place where there are thousands of bodies that were never recovered. It is considered to be sacred ground by both Germany and Belgium. You are not allowed to go in there and dig or do anything to disturb the forest. Just to the north of the Ardennes is a U.S. cemetery. I had the pleasure of accompanying my boss, Admiral Smith, on Memorial Day where he gave a speech. I thought this would be just something we'd go along and see a couple of hundred people that might gather on Memorial Day to pay respects to the over 7,000 U.S. troops that died in the Battle of the Bulge that are buried here. This cemetery is up a very narrow road, and there's only parking for about 20 cars at the front of the cemetery. On that day, there were probably 2,000 people there. They were there not as Americans, they were there as people from the Netherlands and from Belgium, because each one of these graves is tended till this day by a Belgian or Dutch family. They come in the thousands each year on Memorial Day to say thanks to those who gave their lives so that they could be free. A very, very moving experience. Moving back to just outside of Brussels, I wanted to show you some of the Dutch-style housing that was in our neighborhood. The top left picture is a small little cute house. It actually was right next to ours, and two gentlemen that became very, very, very good friends of us. When we would go away, they would park their car in our driveway so it looked like we were home. Actually, our driveway is just to the right of this top right picture, that's the street that we lived on. And that's some other friends that we still correspond with us that lived across the street. The white shapes over those windows are called rollades. They're a metal, like, window shade that comes down that protects the house from sun, and it also protects the house from burglars getting in. This is not our house. This is the home or residence of the U.S. ambassador to NATO. It has a nice 250 car parking lot out front, by the way. This is our home. And you can come to our house and you'll see the flags such as the one that we have out that we still have. A nice little Dutch house, lots of windows which were very hard to clean, and a nice rose garden. I learned how to grow roses while I was in Brussels. As I mentioned, I worked at NATO headquarters, and Carol worked at the Brussels American School. We were a bunch of uptight military types. You know, we worked for General Colin Powell, and yes, he said, do it, and we said, yes, sir, no, sir. Well, Carol's crew was a lot more relaxed. Here, her with a bunch of teachers after school enjoying themselves. I want to end this presentation by saying goodbye in all of the 3 languages of the various countries we have visited. It's been a pleasure introducing you to the Benelux countries if you've never been there, and if you've been there, I hope it was a good time to revisit. Thank you, and I hope to see you in the following weeks with additional presentations. Have a good day, stay home, wear masks, and be safe.